I'm really excited to have you guys listen to my guest today because I really think this is thought leadership for you. And I really believe that it's a very different positioning for you to understand how things are moving in the world. So today we have Annie Graziani, who is a business strategist, a doctor of education from the University of Pennsylvania, and founder of Sovera, a leadership advisory and work life integration con- I can't even say that word.
Consultancy.
Thank you. A leadership advisory and work life integration consultancy built on the thesis that people and profit aren't a trade off. Workforce well being and productivity equal one another, depend on one another, and empower each other. With over 2 decades of corporate leadership across LVMH, Marc Jacobs, and Tapestry, Coach Annie partners with executive teams to align leadership vision with talent execution, strengthening performance without sacrificing the humans that are doing the work. Her research focuses on working parents as organizational experts in sustainable, high output leadership. Welcome, Annie. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. So, I really want people to understand like where you were and how you kind of came up with this pivot that you've created. So, tell people a little bit about your backstory.
Yeah, so I guess it goes really way back. I had the opportunity and the good fortune of being raised with four of my great grandparents and four grandparents around me. So and lots of elders in my family. And so what that did for me is kind of really gave me a unique perspective on intergenerational relationships and just the ways of being in each different generation. So I was exposed to the silent generation, the greatest generation, my parents as baby boomers, and then I'm a late Gen Xer. I have two siblings that are squarely millennials, and now I'm raising 2 generations later, the alpha generation. And so I think a lot of it has been about sort of my positionality within my family unit growing up, responsibility to what that means. My mom was a stay-at-home mom. My dad owned a factory, and we all had some responsibility in our family economy. We had contributions that we had to make it all work, and we had a whole village around us that kind of influenced perception and perspectives and different ways of sort of appreciating the world around us. But the world now is quite a bit different than it was when I was being raised in the early 80s and through the 80s and into the 90s, in that we are more mobile than we've ever been before. So we don't really have those nucleus systems around us. So you sort of have to figure out how to reorient in whatever population, whatever environment we're in. So fast forward some time, I ended up at a small liberal arts school here in Western Pennsylvania where I was raised, and had exposure there or had the opportunity, I should say, to travel outside of that school, to go abroad, to do some apprenticeships, which I think is uniquely different than internships. And I just really kind of took those opportunities to learn about how I situate in the world and experience different cultural kind of behaviors, and really just sort of fold into and observe what goes on in the world around me, regardless of where I am. And as much as possible, kind of just acknowledging my own positionality in those spaces. And then I had the opportunity after college to move to New York City, which was right up my alley, something I had dreamed about since the time I was 5 years old. I always wanted to work in fashion. I learned from a young age how to put things together, how to take things apart, how to sew, how to, use my hands to actually make something happen. Very blue collar upbringing. But also like sort of the bigger picture of how things go together and what it means, So I just kind of like myself as sort of, a person kind of at the center of like, how am I interacting in all these different environments? New York City was like the hotbed for that, right? So I'm stepping into an arena, into the fashion world, and, a young person from Western Pennsylvania, very humble upbringing, trying to figure out my life in New York City. And I was fortunate enough to have landed an amazing position at a couple of great companies. And where I spent most of my time was at Marc Jacobs in its heyday, in the time that the business was really building. And I had exposure there to amazing leadership, really surrounded by clear-headed business building growth mindset leadership. And and a lot of trust. So I, as you know, we were all sort of like young people building this brand with this really great leadership, and we were entrusted to go out there and negotiate in the world and figure out our supply chains and build relationships and all the stuff that actually really matters, the things that are maybe considered to be sort of soft skills, right? Like intercultural relationships. How do we behave in, let's say, Turkey versus China versus Indonesia versus, you know, Tunisia, and how are others responding to the way that we're interacting with them? And we're all really kind of just, you know, at that time contributing to this bigger picture thing, which was the building of this amazing, you know, Marc Jacobs brand. And it was then that I started to realize how to situate myself in a very Dale Carnegie approach, right? It's starting with authenticity. It really matters to light people up and understand that we're all working towards something shared. And what every individual's contribution is to that, the clarity of that matters a lot. So I started to kind of like take a step back. I would go deeply into the roots of the work, you know, really deeply into the trenches of the work with my colleagues and with the factories and the vendors that I was working with, and up to senior leadership. You know, it was like really kind of playing around the organizational chart, but also taking a step back to watch the macro of really what was going on here. Who's really kind of like directing where this ship was going. And so that's when I started to really understand that there was more to it than just the nuance of doing the thing, right? Not in our siloed functions, but that there are mechanisms that are cross-functional and interoperable that really depend on each other. And so I just started to pay a little bit more attention to that and situating my team's perspective on what are we doing together and what our team is doing in contribution to that bigger picture. I had then the opportunity to become involved in several different technology implementations, which mattered a lot, and sort of lifting the curtain for me in my understanding of the interoperability across functional areas and across the globe as well. We had users all over the world. We had multiple legal entities working in different languages. And that really kind of helped me to understand that foundationally in business, everything really begins and ends in finance. So there's a motivating factor that supports all these people, right, in an organization, is how well we're reporting on against that, the budget that was determined at, you know, at the start of any given thing, and how it's actualizing against that, and how efficiently we work as a team, and how clear-headed we are, and with clarity on what that vision is, we're all executing against that vision, and willingly so. And so those kind of like awarenesses led me to an appreciation for really kind of not wanting to pigeonhole my skills, particularly inside of any given organization or even inside of the industry that I had committed to for so long that I absolutely loved. And then I started to realize too, because I was working primarily on the supply chain thing, that side of the industry, that we were producing a lot of waste, right? A lot of excess was building up, and it was affecting the bottom line, and it was affecting how what our factories were doing with this excess product, our warehouses and all this. So I started having this interest in moving into sustainable fashion. So I went to work for a sustainable fashion apparel company for a little while, where there was a lot going on inside of that organization that needed to be, let's say, aligned. It just took a little bit of a higher or a wider perspective and putting the right people in the right places to make sure that we were executing against the vision there too. So it was another chance to kind of like practice these ideas. The shift then happened in that I moved to the technology industry, delivering solutions to the fashion industry. So that was a critical shift in my work trajectory. I was moving away from this like fast track, high potential kind of like leadership, climb the corporate ladder thing, into an entirely new direction that I had to learn, and I had to really learn that arena. And what I realized there is that things just operate differently, right? Like what motivates people is different. How people interact with each other is very different. It was a whole new playground. And I had to figure out how I was going to situate myself in this another new environment. And after I did that for about, a little over 5, maybe almost 6 years, working with, big tech vendors all over the place and also with brands, I realized that it really comes down to the people. How are the people adopting and caring about this thing? And why should they care, and what is their contribution to it? So certain things were sort of like the red thread throughout the entire, all these observations across my career. And then so it was then that I realized I want to put data to this. I was working in data at this point in technology and encouraging the power of data and technology. But I realized that there was maybe another way for me to put some oomph behind my observations. So I went back to school full time in a doctoral program where I had the opportunity to study all of these things. What drives human purpose? How do we motivate people? Human potential, organizational design, all of these different components. And that's where I really kind of found my new, let's say, new chapter that I'm just
Yeah.
entering into.
And what I love about this is that you're really looking at the individual with the environment, right? And how the environment impacts people so much. Tell me a little bit about, because you talked a little bit about the generational impact that your family has had on you. And you're basically, it's very interesting to me because you're basically taking these values and these belief systems and you're bringing them into the workplace. Tell me
Right.
a little bit about if you received any pushback about that.
Um, I think that it's the pushback is subtle, but we all say we want to do the right things,
Right.
and I to start with, the relationship has really been, or the relationship to the intergenerational sort of upbringing that I was fortunate enough to have, is that those prior generations were sort of more sustainable just by nature, right? They knew how to it was a bit of a waste not want not kind of perspective, but they were very efficient in figuring out how to use every single component. They weren't wasteful. They couldn't
Yes.
afford to be wasteful, but they didn't live in a scarcity mindset either. They lived abundantly within what they had. And so it took me some time to kind of make heads or tails of what that really meant. But it really came down to operational efficiency and not wasting, not having wastefulness. And the same is true for people, for product, for services. It's sort of just like how efficiently can we operate amongst each other and with each other. The pushback is when there's not any value that can be produced from the thing. By and large, what I find is that we're not likely to move the needle unless there's some amount of ROI attached, some value-based argument, right, attached to the thing that's changing. Change is really hard. We all know this, right? We know this. We have change management professionals. I consider myself to be one of them, who just sort of know how to motivate. But there's got to be the why attached to it, and there has to be a why for the individuals who are expected to participate and adopt.
Yeah.
But there also has to be a reason for why it's helping the business, and typically, at least here in Western behaviors, it's got to be attached to financials. As much as I wish that wasn't the case, and we would do things out of the goodness of our hearts, business is business, and we've got to make the world go round, and that's our medium to make that happen. And so that's fine. I can equate these change management initiatives to a bottom line impact for sure. And so that's, usually I try to avert pushback by saying, okay, well, there's value here and create the value argument.
I think because especially right now, I mean, there is there's a lot of women that are talking about burnout and the impact that the way that we are currently heading is very detrimental to the future of, people. And so how do you prevent that when you place these systems into organizations?
Yeah. So, so my business, Sovera, is that's exactly the point of it, actually. It's like, how do we actually get to the heart of the people for their own human purpose, right? Which it really, I think we've shifted so far as a society away from intrinsic fulfillment and inner wisdom, and because we've constructed society in a way that successes and metrics have been determined for us. And that is pretty far, right? If we're living under the expectations of what society is putting upon us, then we start to, it's pretty easy to drift away from who you are inside.
Yeah.
And I happen to be a believer that everyone is put here for some purpose, right? I think that we all have a unique contribution to share and shine upon the world, and that is what complements each other's purpose, and that is how we live our own reason for being, and light that up in others as well. When we sort of distract from that, I feel like we become a bit aimless. And so organizationally, it comes down to clarity and transparency. So when an organizational leadership determines, right, whoever it is, the CEO, the board of directors, the C-suite collectively, determine that this is what we have to do as an organization. right? We're going to increase our profit margins. We need to, expand into different geographies or different product lines or service lines, whatever it is. You can really only have, any organization really can only attain a handful of those at most within a reasonable time frame. But there's often a gap between what that need is for the organization to sustain itself or to grow itself, whatever it is, and the people's awareness of it. That's like the first, bridging that gap is first in helping people to remain engaged. And then we've got to ask the people, right? Are you in line with this vision? Does it serve why you thought you were here in the first place? Maybe they don't care, and this is just the medium for them to sustain their human purpose outside of the workplace, right? And sometimes that's okay too, right? It depends on how we receive and engage with work individually. But as long as the job is getting done and we have the right people in the right seats, right, then it becomes more about how to keep the people that are actually contributing meaningfully toward that vision. Mm-hmm. So it's asking the people, what do you need in proximity to the challenges that you're going to be facing? Because we've got to make work for the people. What do we need to move out of the way? How do we help you, right? And this is the balance between well-being and productivity, human purpose, and organizational potential, and relate that to bottom line impact.
Yeah. And your work is so needed because I really see that organizations really need to push towards this for many reasons. We know that when people feel fulfilled, that they will be more productive. So we will see less people away and sick days and all of those things and turnover of staff and all of those, patterns that are showing up. But what's really interesting for me, and I know that you and I had talked before, is I had asked you about what your practices are in working in the corporate world and being like right in there. What are the things that you do to make sure that you are balanced and that you are regulated and that you make sure that you don't get to that place now that you have that knowledge?
Well, it's interesting because what it is now is different than what it was, let's say, pre-pandemic, right? And there's a reason for that. So, pre-pandemic, I had, my father had a heart attack at 54 years old. I was in college at the time. And for me, that was an epiphany moment that stress really does manifest in very physical ways. And so I was sort of very aware of not allowing the stress of work in any way to kind of really get to me, right? So I was kind of like a calm, operator, right? Like just very calm in how I engaged with work. There was a moment where that shifted, and I was operating under duress at one point in my career, and that was easy to become aware of. It wasn't like I had normalized that stress and what it was doing to my physical self. So I ejected myself from that situation because I had to. I a little daughter at home, and I needed to be able to take care of myself so that I could take care of my family. So pre-pandemic, boundaries were more clear, right? When you left the workplace, the laptop, it's hard to remember this now because it's been a while, but the laptop would typically stay in the workplace, right? Yeah. I mean, we had cell phones, but we weren't really pinging each other. Teams and, and Zoom and these things weren't as accessible to the greater population at that time. If you were in tech maybe or in certain industries, sure. But for the most part, work stayed at work. So it was a matter of like leaving at a certain time. But once you did leave, even if you overextended and worked 10-hour days, you were basically done. Yeah. I did start to practice, back to the story about my dad, I did start to practice yoga at a very young age. And I was doing it sort of sporadically over the course of my life because he had started to practice yoga to regulate his stress levels. And so that was like, that influenced me to also find ways that I thought I could handle in my life and, in those growth moments of my life. And that was sort of like sprinkling, yoga, bar, whatever I could squeeze in to kind of like to balance. Yeah. I think good food matters a lot as well. For sure. And so these have always been important to me. Drinking a lot of water was also critical. So these things have not changed. These are all still very much a part of my life. But so the pandemic was a shifting point for everybody, actually, our entire work society. And there are several factors that kind of lend to that. And that was what used to be considered, and this is why my research became so profound for me and putting data behind my own reality, is that, there are theories that kind of guided my research that helped me to get my head around the place of work in our lives. And that was job demand resource model, which is, how the workplace is providing resources to help employees engage with work. I mean, in a nutshell, it's more or less that. And that what those are have changed. It used to be, healthcare benefits and mental health resources and potentially childcare and typical organizational support structures that kind of support the worker. That has completely changed now. Now it's definitely much more about soft skills and things like that. So it's like, who's the manager? Mm-hmm. Is policy conflicting with what, is organizational policy conflicting with how the manager manages? Empathy and things like that. And so those kinds of things. The other one would be like boundary theory, right? Like how we actually have permission to create boundaries for ourselves, which used to exist sort of by nature of how we operated as a work society, which has completely shifted post-pandemic because of our always-on culture. And so, and then the last one is role theory, the number of roles that we play and the different dimensions of who we are in our personal domain and our work domain. So since the pandemic, just in saying what those three guiding theories were, that is dramatically, all of them have shifted in what their definition used to be to where it is now. And so now post-pandemic, it's been tricky. I left working in corporate for the past 4 years. It took me 2 years to become part of the Great Resignation, and it was something that I had not had the courage to do prior. Right. And that is because I'm sort of like a meaningful earner in my family, in my household, and it took a lot of consideration on what that would disrupt for our children, for ourselves, what we have access to, and all of that. Ultimately, I realized that I was shifting from being an earner to being a contributor to more people. And that was, so what that did for me is it gave me a lot more time. I bought my time back by leaving corporate and turning on my own consulting practice. And it was sort of, for the time that I was in school, was doing what I had already done, which is digital transformation work and change management for the adoption of technology for organizations, and for the people of the organizations. So because that was sort of part-time, and then I started my doctorate, that gave me a lot of time to take care of myself, right? Grow in my yoga practice, spend more meaningful present time with my children and my husband and my parents. So that shifted a lot. It wasn't without sacrifice though. So it's not like, we're not an independently wealthy family. There were decisions that we had to make about our lifestyle and right-sizing it to accommodate that. And that is very difficult for a lot of people. But considering this was my research, I felt like I had to be at the center. I also had to be subject to it. And so we made a decision to do that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but I also think it's really interesting because it sounds like as I'm listening to you tell your story, it's like you went right back to the original thing that you saw, which was the way your family dynamics were, the way that like your belief systems were, even to the fact that when you saw that it was getting to the point where, it was a very difficult time for you in the workplace, you were like, this is not healthy. Almost like you had the awareness of everything that your dad went through and you were like, I'm going to take myself out of this. So I love that because you're literally like very observant. You've seen all of the things and you're implementing in a very, I would say intentional, but almost like it's a subconscious intentional thing. Like it seems like it's just a part of you, which is really brilliant, I think.
Thank you. Yes, I mean, I do think that it was sort of like this, the only ones who can make change for us is ourselves. There's nobody coming in to solve or give us direction, maybe to question. I mean, coaches and therapists and mentors, they can sort of help guide. It's very unusual for someone to say, this is the path you should take, right? Because there's a lot of responsibility there. So I think it really comes down to, intuition and what feels right and what doesn't feel right. And then it's stepping into your agency, knowing that we really only have but a handful, maybe 2 handfuls of decades to be here. And when you sort of reverse engineer from how much time we've contributed and what our talents are and leap ahead to where we'll be in decades from now and sort of go back from there, it's like, what changes would you make, right? I mean, these things we know. We've heard stories about regrets, from, those who are aged, and 76% of people or whatever it is, right, have regrets about what they didn't do and all these stats. And I just didn't want to have those regrets. And so I have a tendency to want to challenge things like that. It's just the way I am. And I learned from a very young age. Think I was in high school. I was a senior in high school actually, and my cousin gave me a quote that said, "Make the dash count."
Mm.
And that has also subconsciously been with me, right? So it's like, why not fill up the dash, right? Like, what do we really need to sustain? What do we really want to sustain our lives? And how do we want to experience this one life that we're here to contribute to, right? I mean, I think we're meant to be here for, like I said, for a purpose, and we have something to contribute. But it takes a journey sometimes to figure out what that contribution should be. And in the meantime, for me, it was about experiencing different parts, different chapters of what life could be, so that I could get to this point where I felt like the doctorate was the culminating moment. And that's why I invested in this, this time and, and financially to go back to school to kind of make that happen. And from that was, is Sovera. And Sovera is the contribution. So I really believe that that's the thing that helps others center back on who they are at their core, at the soul of who they are. Mm-hmm. And it's a lot to expect of something that I'm building, but I don't think it's unattainable, right? Because we're helping people to acknowledge you actually have agency over how you design your life.
Yeah.
It comes down to what you want. Yeah.
And I think it's brilliant work because it really is what is needed. But I want to pull in a few things that you said. One is like you trusted your intuition. And one of the things that I really believe is that like our bodies are always talking to us. And you even mentioned it, there are some people that are in a job because they basically feel like their entire life is tied to that income, and they will stay forever because of that feeling of they're tied to it. And so one of the things that I really would love you to talk a little bit about is like, what is the intention behind what you're building? And if you were speaking to somebody that was in corporate, that really was on the verge of burnout, how would you kind of advise them to start taking care of themselves?
I would start with identifying, and I did this actually in my research in a slightly different way, but I would say take inventory, right? What is important in this phase, this season of life? And then how effectively are you contributing to that thing that you just said is important? And so one of the things that I was able to develop across the research and just in my observations and conversations and data is essentially 11 different dimensions that should be considered. And then it's a matter of how tightly are we balancing what we said was important. And I think this is also related back to the pandemic. Our priorities changed dramatically during the pandemic, right?
Absolutely.
We acknowledged that life is finite, and we decided, I mean, at that time it was frightening. I mean, we didn't really know who was going to end up with this thing and if people were dying and how, life became very real, or we should say that our awareness of the finiteness of life became more aware in our society. And so we prioritized and we also optimized. And so it's a matter of like, what levers do we pull to get back in balance with what we think is important right now, which is different. What's important to me now in my 40s is way different than what was important to me in my 20s or even just 10 years ago, certainly from 6 years ago, right when the pandemic started. So I think it comes down to that, is really taking inventory on what is important, what are your priorities, and how you're living your life according to those priorities.
Yeah, and I think the other really important part too is like, how are you balancing the other part of yourself? Not just the one that is tied to your work. It's the other one that is the one that's going to give you that balance. You talked about, doing a bar class or doing yoga and that sort of thing. And I think that that's really important, is like you have to have something to balance yourself out. And so many people are overworking and their day is bleeding into their personal life, and that they don't have that separation. They don't have that ability to down regulate. And so I think that that's a really important thing that you said, but people really need to be encouraged to do so more now than ever.
I believe that. I think that we really need to permission ourselves to have relaxation as part of our everyday lives. And it's gotten so much harder because of tech adoption that happened during the pandemic. There's an expectation across all of us in our personal lives and in all domains, right? In our personal lives and especially in our work domain, to be always on. Because everybody's always on now. So there's an immediacy, right? There's an urgency to responding to the person who's texting you or emailing you or right or liking the thing, whatever it is. There's an expectation of urgency. And there is some pushback happening among younger generations, as I think probably many of us know, right? They're starting to abandon technology and going back to landlines and all these things. And I think it's very interesting, but it's a really difficult thing to do, to extract ourselves and put up those boundaries, which is why boundary theory was actually one of my guiding frameworks for my research, and also rule theory, so that we could turn off different parts of who we are. I think we have to find other parts. We have to find things that bring us peace and joy that are not difficult. Yes. And sprinkle that throughout our day. So that could be, one of the things I talk about in some of my speaking engagements is the permission to relax. And how do we create an everyday vacation mindset in the everyday? And that could be like very simple, right? It could be music. It can be stopping the madness to have a cup of tea or take a walk around the block, or right, or actually make a healthy meal or have a good meal.
Yep.
It could be meditation and breath work. It could be calling people that you haven't spoken to in a really long time, right? Lots of little tiny things like that could matter a lot. And it has to be accessible. That's the other thing. If it's a big, initiative like, oh, I'm gonna, run a marathon and I've never been a runner, maybe start with, a mile run, right? Like, or something much smaller, a 10-minute run. And so it's gotta be something that when you step into that, it actually brings joy to and balance. Whatever that is. So it could be spending time with your children sitting on the sofa and just giving them your attention without devices. Like, it could be that simple.
Yeah, and I think the more that you are bombarded, or the more you feel dysregulated, or the more that is happening in your world, the smaller the changes have to be, because people think they need to do these big things to balance themselves out, but it's over consistency with just those little small habits that are really going to create that change and that feeling. I want to just get you to touch just very briefly on something that you and I talked about, but I would love you to kind of talk about the cultural difference in some countries and how the productivity has shown up there with using some different types of practices, like, they have siesta in Spain, for example. Tell me a little bit about what you found in those environments and how you think maybe we could benefit from maybe injecting some of those things here.
Yeah, so I have some, because of the topic of my research, I really did want to understand this. Iceland has introduced a 32-hour work week, and like 86% of the working population has adopted this now with no loss to productivity. So, to be fair, Iceland is a much smaller population than we are. So not all of what I'm hoping to do in future research is to study what of that could be applied here in this culture, because our culture is quite different. Opinions than facts right now, because I haven't actually done a dedicated research study to this. I did spend some time throughout Europe. So I've lived in France, I lived in Italy for a short period of time, and I've traveled quite a bit. There are some societies, right, that are working more, and they're working 6 days a week, and that's normal practice. So, okay, that's kind of nice that we get at least 2 days a week. But Spain just passed legislation. Spain's particularly interesting to me because as a large European, nation, they legislated a 37.5-hour work week, which has been in trial for a long time, but also doesn't sound like a meaningful reduction from a 40-hour work week, right? But where it comes from is actually what's important. And two things really. Where it comes from, the intention of caring for the well-being of the workforce is where it's coming from, right? The workforce is pushing back and the governance is responding to it, right? There's legislation that's actually responding to how the people are experiencing work in their lives. And that is powerful because the people are speaking and it's being heard. The other thing is that, just imagine every Friday afternoon or every partial afternoon, you can do something else that's not tied to a desk, right? And the dot doesn't have to be green. That would be incredibly meaningful for me, because what I would do, right, is I would take my appointments at that time, like my doctor's appointments, or take my kids to things. It's just a few extra hours where the pressure is off. It just takes the pressure off. This is where more opinion comes into play, is that I just don't think that we have acknowledged the importance of not squeezing employees for every single thing. We have a mindset of everyone is replaceable. And through Sovera, my argument is yes, and at a cost to your bottom line, right? Right? Which I think, yes, everybody is replaceable, but if you lose the good people, it's costing, they're going to your competition or they're exiting the workforce entirely. Or they're, they're whatever, right? Like they leave or they're disengaged. And all of those are at a cost to the bottom line. Replacing that institutional knowledge, trying to train people up, trying to recruit, you're going to pay more for new employees than you had for the. So that all matters. And we have just ignored the metrics that are attached to losing good people. The bigger thing, the bigger point here is then what are we doing to our national economy when we exit people from the workforce because we're not respecting them and their contribution to the workforce? We need to make it easy for people to want to stay, the right people to stay in the workplaces where they've already committed. If they're the right people and they're in the right place, we've got to make it easy for them to stay. And we have not taken that approach.
I also think the bigger picture too, on top of that, is like the health of the population is like going downhill. And we really need to figure out a new way to really make sure that the levels of stress that people are experiencing because of the workload, because of the fast-paced society we live in, because we are not being encouraged to inject those little moments of joy, because we can't turn off, because they're doom scrolling, people are numbing themselves more and more because they are disconnected. And I feel like the bigger picture is what are the things that we can do in order to make people feel connected again? And I think that's what your company is really trying to do. It's like, let's help, the human side come back into the workforce so that we really can, maintain these people, maintain great workspaces, and then better humanity.
And that's it exactly is, what are we all, if we're thinking short-sighted about profits over people, which is common practice here, especially here in North America, specifically here in the United States, then it's a very selfish approach to it all. And we have lost sight of human potential as a whole society and like how we're evolving as a human population. So, okay, not everybody cares about that. Most people probably don't care about that. But it's because we haven't educated each other on the importance of it, right? So through Sovera, that is the work, is to say, okay, that's what really, really matters. That's why I'm doing this work. That's why I've kind of paused my corporate, that's why I left it, right, was to do this work. And it only works if we can say there's ROI attached to it. Do I love that argument? I don't. But that's if that's what has to happen for the greater good of the human population in small ways and in big ways, then that's fine. I can say that language. I can speak to the C-suite about ROI. It benefits them too. It benefits the organization. The organization sustains better and they're more efficient. Fine. The people do matter, and how they're engaging does matter, not just in the immediate short term, but like for where we're going as a human population. And that is the contribution, right? That's what I'm hoping to contribute.
Well, I just want to say thank you for being a founder and finding, a way to make that dash a lot more meaningful for people. Because I really truly believe like you are making a difference by doing something very different, but you're also really looking for the data that supports it so that change does happen. So I just wanted to say thank you for all the work that you're doing and supporting people that are in the workforce, but also people that are founders, people that are, humans that live in the corporate world. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Well, we're really grateful to have you. And if anyone wants to reach out to you, Annie, how can they get a hold of you?
Yeah, sure. They can find me on LinkedIn, Annie Graziani, or on soverastrategy.com.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for coming on, and I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. And like I said, you can reach out to Annie if you have any questions for her, and I'm sure you will be hearing a lot more from her as well. So thank you again.